I thought the vacation was for my 70th birthday, but when my son refused to look me in the eye while handing a stranger my suitcase, I realized the trip was actually a one-way ticket to being forgotten. My name is Elara, and for 70 years, I believed that the love you pour into a child creates a reservoir that will sustain you in your winter years. I was wrong. My son, Kale, was my only heartbeat after my husband, Silas, passed away in the house we built with our own 4 hands. For months, Kale had become a shadow, his visits dwindling to quick, impatient phone calls that felt more like errands than affection. So, when he called me with a voice as syrupy and sweet as summer peaches, telling me to pack light for a surprise mother-son weekend, I didn't question it, I celebrated it. I spent the morning humming old gospel songs, carefully selecting my finest silk blouse and the silver locket Silas had gifted me. I even tucked a photo of Kale into my bag, a picture of him at 5 years old, missing his front teeth and grinning like the world was his to conquer. I looked around my home, touching the door frames and the scarred kitchen table, feeling a surge of hope that we were finally turning a corner, that my son finally remembered I existed. When the car pulled up, it wasn't the familiar old sedan Kale used to drive. It was a sleek, silent electric SUV, shiny and black like a polished obsidian stone. Kale sat behind the wheel, his eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses that made him look like a stranger from a television drama. Beside him sat his wife, Sloane. She didn't get out to hug me. She simply tapped the dashboard with her manicured nails, her hair slicked back so tight it looked painful. When I climbed into the back seat, the car smelled of expensive leather and Sloane's sharp, metallic perfume, a scent that felt cold compared to the vanilla and old books of my home. "Ready for your surprise, Mom?" Kale asked, his voice tight, his eyes fixed firmly on the rearview mirror rather than meeting mine. I asked where we were going, but Sloane just waved a hand dismissively, murmuring about rest and peace and how stressed I had looked lately. I ignored the sinking feeling in my gut because that's what mothers do. We ignore the splinters our children drive into our hearts because we're too busy trying to keep them warm. We drove for 2 hours, leaving the familiar trees of my neighborhood for flat, gray highways and a silence so heavy it felt like a third passenger. Kel's hands never stopped moving on the steering wheel, a nervous, frantic rhythm that screamed the truth his lips refused to speak. When we finally pulled off the road, my heart stopped. We weren't at a resort. We were idling in front of a squat, beige brick building with rusted window frames and a sign that glowed with a sickly green light, Evergreen Manor Assisted Living. There were no bellhops, no mountains, just a nurse in faded scrubs holding a clipboard and wearing a smile that was far too wide to be honest. Before I could even ask what was happening, Kale was out of the car, grabbing my bag from the trunk without looking back. "Kale, what is this?" I whispered, my voice cracking like dry wood. He wouldn't look at me. He looked past me, through me, as if I were already a ghost. Inside, the lobby smelled of industrial bleach and boiled cabbage, a scent that sticks to your clothes and tells you that you've been discarded. I saw a man in a wheelchair staring blankly at a flickering television, and I felt the ground tilt beneath my feet. Sloane stepped forward and handed a thick manila envelope to the receptionist, her voice crisp and professional, as she discussed paperwork and admissions as if she were checking a coat at a theater. When I protested, Kale finally looked at me, but his eyes were hard. "Mom, you're forgetting things," he lied, his voice echoing in the sterile lobby. He brought up a time I'd supposedly gotten lost at the grocery store. I hadn't been lost. I was just reading labels, and a time I'd left the stove on, which was actually a power surge. He painted a picture of a woman who was a danger to herself, a burden that needed to be managed. "I don't want to stay here," I pleaded, grabbing the edge of the counter to keep from collapsing. But Kale just checked his watch, claiming he had a meeting he couldn't miss. He told me not to make it harder than it has to be, as if my betrayal were an inconvenience to his schedule. And then, just like that, they walked out. I watched through the glass doors as they climbed back into that shiny black SUV and drove away without a single backward glance. I was left standing in a room with plastic flowers and a window that didn't open, clutching Silas's locket until the metal bit into my palm. That night, I realized the most painful part of the betrayal wasn't the loss of my house. It was the realization that Kale hadn't left me there because he was worried. He left me there because it was easier to forget me than to love me. He wanted the house, he wanted the pension, and he wanted the silence. I thought they took my house because they were overwhelmed. But when I overheard the nurse mention the for sale sign on my lawn, I realized my son wasn't protecting me, he was liquidating me. They tell you that memory loss makes you a burden, but they never tell you that the people who love you most are the ones who will use your confusion as a weapon to steal your very existence. The first week at Evergreen Manor felt like being buried alive in a room that smelled of artificial lavender and despair. I spent the first 48 hours sitting by the window, my eyes tracing the driveway, waiting for that sleek black SUV to return. I told myself there had been a mistake, that Kale would rush back, tears in his eyes, apologizing for the misunderstanding. But the sun rose unset 7 times, and the only person who entered my room was a rotation of nurses with plastic cups of pills and lukewarm oatmeal. On the 3rd day, I tried to call Kale, my fingers trembling as I dialed the number I had known by heart since he was a boy. It went straight to a generic voicemail. On the 4th day, the line was disconnected. It was then that the cold, hard truth began to settle into my bones. I hadn't been placed here for my health. I had been deleted from his life. I stopped eating. I let the sheets tangle around my legs like vines, staring at the ceiling and wondering how the boy I had worked double shifts for so he could have the best education could now use that very intellect to trap me. I thought of the winters I went without a new coat so he could have the latest gadgets, and the way I had skipped meals so he could have seconds. I remembered sewing Sloane's wedding veil by hand, my eyes straining under a dim lamp for weeks, just so they could save money for their future. It turns out their future didn't have room for a mother who knew too much. I felt like a ghost, a remnant of a past that Kale was eager to burn. In this place, I wasn't Elara, the woman who built a home and a life. I was just a bed number in a file, a patient with a diagnosis of forgetfulness that had been weaponized against me. The turning point came on a Tuesday night. The facility was quiet, save for the distant, rhythmic beep of a monitor and the soft squeak of rubber soles on linoleum. A nurse I hadn't seen much before, a woman named Rhea, entered my room. She didn't just drop a tray and leave. She sat in the chair by my bed, her eyes sharp and observant. "You've been here a week, Elara," she said, her voice slow and steady. "You haven't eaten. You've barely moved. You're letting them win." I looked at her, my voice a mere croak, and asked why my son would do this. Rhea leaned forward, her expression hardening. "I've seen it 1,000 times, she whispered. "They call it a wellness retreat, or a checkup. And then they hand over the paperwork and walk away without a backward glance." Rhea told me something that made the room spin. She had seen the intake notes. Kale had told the facility that I was suffering from advanced cognitive decline, claiming I was a danger to myself because I was burning down the house. He had used a forged doctor's note and a simple pharmacy receipt for multivitamins as proof of my dementia. He had painted me as a hollow shell so he could step into the role of protector while secretly acting as a predator. My grief, which had been a heavy, suffocating blanket, suddenly caught fire. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't weak. I was betrayed. Rhea reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. "This is Thorne," she said. "She is a lawyer who specializes in elders who have been disappeared by their own blood. She got my aunt out of a place just like this." I looked at that name, Thorne, and felt a pulse of electricity return to my hands. Rhea warned me that I had to act fast. She had overheard a conversation at the front desk. Sloane had already been in contact with a realtor, and a for sale sign was being hammered into the lawn of the house Silas and I had built with our own sweat. My son wasn't just waiting for me to fade away. He was actively erasing every trace of my existence so he could fund a life he hadn't earned. I sat up in bed, the strength returning to my spine for the first time in a week. I wasn't going to rot here. I wasn't going to be the confused old woman they wanted me to be. I looked at my reflection in the darkened window. The woman Silas loved was still there, and she was finally ready to fight back. I called the number, expecting a lawyer, but I found an executioner of lies who told me something that made my blood run cold. Your son didn't just take your house, Elara. He's already started spending your funeral fund. Forging a signature is easy, but erasing a mother's soul is a lot harder than my son anticipated when he decided to trade my life for a down payment on a beach house. Castian Thorne arrived at the facility 2 days later, her presence cutting through the stagnant air of Evergreen Manor like a cold wind. She wore a suit the color of a storm cloud, and her eyes were the sharpest thing I had seen in weeks. She didn't offer me the patronizing pity the nurses did. She sat down, opened a thick manila folder, and looked at me as a peer and equal. Elara, she said, her voice a low, steady hum, your son and his wife have been very busy while you've been sitting here staring at these walls. She laid out the documents that Cale and Sloane had filed emergency power of attorney papers that had been submitted 2 months before the surprise trip even began. They had used a pharmacy receipt for simple vitamins to claim I was on memory support medication, creating a paper trail of a decline that didn't exist. As Castian flipped through the pages, my stomach twisted into a knot of pure ice. They hadn't just placed me here. They had begun a systematic liquidation of everything Silas and I had spent 40 years building. Sloane had already entered a verbal agreement with a buyer for my home, and the for sale sign I'd heard about was just the beginning. Cale had used his forged authority to freeze my personal bank accounts and was already rerouting Silas's pension into a joint account he shared with Sloane. To the court, you are a tragic case of early onset dementia, Castian explained, her jaw tight. But to Cale and Sloane, you are a liquid asset, a name attached to a house and a checkbook that they want to close for good. The betrayal wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a strategy, a cold-blooded business move executed by the person I had once taught to tie his shoes. Castian reached into her briefcase and handed me a legal pad and a pen. I need you to fight back with the only weapon they can't forge, your memory, she said. She instructed me to write down every lie Cale had told, every conversation about the resort, and every detail of the day they left me. My hands shook as the pen touched the paper, but as the ink flowed, so did the fire in my veins. I wrote until my fingers cramped, documenting how Cale had told me to pack light because we'd be back before I knew it. I wrote about how he avoided my eyes in the car and how Sloane had hummed a tuneless song while they drove me to my own living funeral. I remembered every word, every sharp perfume scent, and every nervous rhythm Cale had tapped on the steering wheel. Rhea, the night shift nurse, became our silent ally, sneaking in to provide written statements on facility letterhead. She documented that Cale had told the intake staff I was confused and had agreed to the placement, directly contradicting my reality. We were building a mountain of evidence that Cale's good intentions were actually a calculated fraud. Every time I felt like giving up, I thought of the for sale sign on my lawn and the photo Sloane had sent of my empty living room. They weren't just stealing my house. They were stealing the place where I had raised a son I no longer recognized. But they had made one fatal mistake. They thought I was too old to remember, and they thought I was too broken to speak. We filed the petition to revoke their power. But just as the wheels of justice began to turn, I received a package from Sloane that contained a single, chilling item, a photo of my empty living room with a note that said, "Don't make this harder than it has to be. Mom." They thought they could bury me in a nursing home and wait for the silence to consume me. But they forgot that a mother knows all her children's secrets, and I was finally ready to tell them. The day the judge signed the order for my immediate release felt like the first time the sun had touched my skin in a century. It wasn't a wellness retreat discharge. It was a legal extraction. As Castian Thorne drove me away from the beige bricks of Evergreen Manor, I didn't look back at the building that had almost swallowed my identity. Instead, I looked at my hands, still marked by the pen indentations from days of writing down the truth. Castian's car was quiet, but the air between us was charged with the electricity of a coming storm. She had successfully frozen the accounts Cale had drained, but the house, my home, was still a battlefield. When we turned the corner into my neighborhood, the sight of my porch brought a lump to my throat. The for sale sign Cale had hammered into the earth was leaning precariously. a symbol of a plan that was beginning to rot from the inside out. Stepping out of the car, the ground felt solid, real, and rightfully mine for the first time in weeks. I walked to the front door, my hand shaking as I inserted the key Cale thought he had rendered useless. The house was exactly as I had left it, dusty, quiet, and mourning the absence of life. I walked from room to room, touching the armchairs Silas had loved and the bookshelf where Cale's graduation photos still stood, mocking me with their frozen smiles. But on the kitchen island sat a fresh envelope. Sloane's handwriting. Inside was a single photo of my empty living room with a note. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Mom. It's better this way." I didn't cry. I walked to the fireplace, struck a match, and watched the paper curl into black ash. The news of my resurrection traveled through the neighborhood like wildfire. Old friends who had been told I was comfortable and cared for began to call, their voices thick with shock and shame for believing the lies my son had spun. One neighbor, an elderly man named Arthur, stopped by to tell me he'd seen Cale and Sloane hauling boxes out of my basement in the dead of night, like thieves in their own heritage. I spent the next 48 hours cleaning, not because of the dust, but to scrub the scent of their betrayal from the walls. Every time my back ached, I remembered the intake notes at the nursing home. The way Cale had described me as a burden to the staff while he was busy liquidating my life. Castian called me on the second night with news that felt like a cold blade. Sloane hadn't just been planning to sell the house. She had already used the down payment from the pending sale to secure a luxury condo in the city, using my pension as collateral. They were living on the spoils of a war they thought they'd already won. I found more drafts of Sloane's letters in the trash can, notes detailing how they would rebrand my disappearance to our relatives. "Some wounds you clean with silence," Rhea had told me, and I finally understood. I wasn't just reclaiming a building. I was reclaiming the narrative of my life. I called Cale one last time. When he answered, his voice was a frantic, high-pitched mess of excuses. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I simply told him, "The mother you thought was too old to remember has a very long memory, Cale, and the court is listening." The court date was set, and for the first time, Cale and Sloane were forced to face me. But as I walked into that courtroom, I saw Sloane whispering to a new lawyer, and I realized they had one final, desperate lie left to tell. The judge asked if I had anything to say to the son who tried to erase me, and as the room went silent, I realized the greatest punishment wasn't the prison sentence, it was the fact that I no longer felt his absence. The courtroom smelled of old paper, floor wax, and the cold, unyielding weight of the law. I sat in the front row, my back as straight as the pines that used to surround my home, with Castian Thorne by my side. Across the aisle, the chair next to the defense table was empty. Cale hadn't shown up, a cowardice that felt like his final admission of guilt. Sloane sat there, however, whispering frantically to a lawyer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. She wouldn't look at me, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for a loophole in the truth we had spent weeks meticulously documenting. The judge, a man with glasses perched precariously on his nose, flipped through the file. Castian had prepared the forged signatures, the logs of my confusion written by a son who wasn't there, and the financial records showing my pension flowing into their lifestyle. Every page he turned sounded like a heartbeat, loud and insistent in the heavy silence. "I have reviewed the statements from Nurse Rhea and the neighbor. Arthur," the judge began, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "It is abundantly clear that Ms. Elara was placed into Evergreen Manor under false pretenses based on documentation that was misleading, unauthorized, and in several instances outright forged." He looked at me directly, his gaze softening for a fleeting second as he commended my resilience in defending my rights. Effective immediately, the court stripped Cale and Sloane of every legal thread they had tried to weave around my life. The power of attorney was voided. Their names were scrubbed from my accounts, and a permanent protective order was issued to ensure they could never touch my home or my peace again. Castian leaned in and whispered, "It's over, Elara, you're free." But the freedom felt heavy. It was the freedom of a woman who had survived a shipwreck only to realize the person who pushed her overboard was the one she had loved most. As I left the courthouse, the sun hit my face with a warmth that felt like a blessing. I didn't feel the surge of joy I expected, but rather a profound clarity. Back at home, I stood in the kitchen and listened to the hum of the refrigerator, a normal, beautiful sound that told me I was no longer a ghost. I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write my true legacy, not a legal document, but a testament to what love truly is and what it isn't. I left my wedding band to Ria, the stranger who saw me when my own son chose to look away. I left my journals to Cassian so she could see the voice she helped recover. And to my home, I designated that it become a sanctuary for others who find themselves discarded by their kin. I left one final note for Kale. You taught me what love isn't. That was the last lesson I needed, the last I heard. Kale and Sloan were facing foreclosure on the condo they bought with my stolen life, and their reputations had crumbled under the weight of the fraud charges. They were couch surfing with friends, realizing too late that a life built on betrayal has no foundation. I didn't celebrate their downfall, but I didn't stop it either. Some fires you have to let burn until there's nothing left but ash. I spent that evening on my porch, jotting down old family recipes, gumbo and peach cobbler, preparing to fill my house with the laughter of people who actually want to be there. I lit a candle beside the photo of Silas and whispered, I'm alright now. They didn't win. I didn't get back everything I lost, but I got back the one thing they thought I'd never find again. I got back myself. This story is a reminder that your worth is not determined by those who fail to see it, even if they are your own flesh and blood. Elara's journey from a discarded burden to a woman of reclaimed power shows that it is never too late to stand up for your truth and protect your legacy. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of the strength of the elders in your life, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of resilience and justice. Remember, you are never alone, and your voice is your greatest weapon. Until next time, stay strong and keep your fire burning.